About 20 years ago, academic publishing had a fairly obvious problem. Scientists did the research, scientists wrote the papers, scientists reviewed the papers, of course, for free, and then universities paid publishers large amounts of money so the scientists could read the same papers that scientists had written. This was considered somehow ridiculous. The proposed solution was open access. The idea was simple and difficult to argue with. Publicly funded research should be publicly available. And today, much more scientific literature is indeed freely accessible. The problem solved. Except that somebody eventually had to pay the bill. And if you assumed that the cost would not come out of the publisher's pocket, you were right. The bill came back to scientists and universities, and somehow publishing a paper now routinely costs thousands of euros. For viewers on the other side of Atlantic, euro is something like $1. People in Europe use it to buy coffee, groceries. And Nature, they can buy golden open access, currently priced at 10,850 euros for one paper. Researchers pay article processing charges, universities enter enormous publishing agreements, libraries still spend substantial amounts on access. Universities employ people simply to administer all of this, and scientific publishing remains remarkably profitable. In 2025, RELX, Scientific, Technical and Medical Division, which includes Elsevier, but also databases and analytics products, generated about 2.7 billion in revenue and just over 1 billion of adjusted operating profit. This is an adjusted operating margin of roughly 38%. To be fair, this is not just journal publishing. Still, those are sort of margins that can make executives in pharmaceutical companies slightly jealous. So we may have successfully reformed academic publishing so that everyone can read the papers, while somehow making the whole system much more expensive. And perhaps, importantly, we changed the incentives of scientific publishing in ways we did not fully anticipate. So how did the system work before? The traditional model was mainly based on subscriptions. Libraries paid journals for access. This created obvious problems. If your university did not subscribe, you could not click on interesting paper and encounter one of the academia's most reproducible findings. Purchase this article for €39.95 for a 6-page PDF written by academics, reviewed by academics, often funded by taxpayers. The academics supply the paper and much of the quality control, while the publisher retained the commercial rights. It was an impressively efficient division of labor, clearly not an ideal system. But there is one aspect of that old business model worth thinking about. The journal's customer was primarily the reader, or more accurately, reader's library. For a journal to remain valuable, people had to believe that what it published was worth reading. Selectivity therefore had economic value. A journal publishing 100 excellent papers did not necessarily make more money by publishing 1,000 mediocre ones. It might actually damage the product. Prestige, curation, scarcity were part of what the journal was selling. And then we changed who the customer was. The reader no longer pays. The author pays, or the author's university, or author's grant. Which sounds like a small accounting change, but it creates a very important shift in incentives. If a journal receives several thousand euros for every accepted paper, every additional accepted paper can generate additional revenue. Publishing more becomes economically attractive. It certainly does not mean that every open access journal publishes bad science, but incentives matter. And when revenue increases with number of papers you publish, you have created a system which publication volume is financially rewarded. The results are not particularly mysterious. Mega journals, thousands of special issues, expanding families of sister journals, allowing a manuscript rejected by the flagship title to remain safely within the same corporate ecosystem, entire publishing operations built around enormous throughput. At its peak, in 2013, PLOS ONE published about 31,000 papers in a single year. This is roughly 85 papers per day, or one new scientific paper every 18 minutes, 24 hours a day. And that was one journal. Now, to be clear, PLOS ONE deliberately used a different editorial model. Papers were judged mainly on scientific and technical validity rather than whether the editors predicted that they were sufficiently important. That is a perfectly legitimate experiment in publishing, but it does demonstrate what happens when selectivity based on perceptive importance is removed as a major constraint. Scale becomes possible, a lot of scale. Global scientific output has roughly doubled since the mid-2000s, from about 1.3 million papers per year to well over 3 million annually today. And as most academics will recognize, there is also a continuous stream of emails explaining that some journal that you have never heard of would be deeply honored if you submit paper by Friday. Judging by my inbox, scientific publishing is suffering from serious shortage of manuscripts. But at least we solved the access, right? The strongest argument for open access is obvious. Science becomes much more easy to access. Someone almost anywhere in the world can now find many of my papers and read them immediately. It is genuinely a good thing. But sometimes I wonder whether we exaggerate the size of the problem we solved. I started my academic career in Slovakia. Again, for those viewers on the other side of Atlantic, Slovakia is a country in Europe. It is a different country from Slovenia, where your first lady comes from. We have nothing to do with it. Coming back to the real stuff. At the time, institutional access to journals in Slovakia was considerably worse than in large Western universities. And yet, if we genuinely needed a paper, we usually got it. We asked a colleague with access, we asked somebody working abroad, we contacted the corresponding author. Researchers were generally quite happy to send you their paper. There were also apparently some less official and slightly shady methods. I know nothing about those, I just read it from a friend. Liar! It was inconvenient, it was inefficient, but scientific knowledge was not locked inside the Fort Knox. For many working researchers, the change we achieved was not from "this paper is impossible to obtain" to "this paper is accessible." It was more often a change from "send me an email and wait" to "click directly on a PDF. That is certainly an improvement, but the question is whether that improvement required to rebuild the economics of the entire publishing ecosystem. There was maybe another possible solution. We could perhaps have done something much simpler. Keep the journal and subscriptions, keep professional editors, keep selective paper reviews, and require that every accepted manuscript resulted from public funding become freely available in a public repository within a defined period. Anyone could read the science, perhaps after a short delay, and journal could still sell what it actually added. The editorial process, the formatted publication, commentary, curation, prestige, advertising, and perhaps most importantly, selection. And this was not some hypothetical alternative nor would we have considered. The US National Institute of Health essentially did this. Since 2008, NIH-funded final peer-reviewed manuscripts had to be deposited to the PubMed Central, with the original mandatory policy requiring public availability no longer than 12 months after publication. Since that policy, more than 1.5 million NIH-supported articles have been made freely available through PubMed Central. So we actually ran the experiment. Repositories work. We could have expanded this model much more aggressively and made accepted scientific manuscript close to universally accessible without making the author's desire to publish such an important source of publisher revenue. Instead, we increased an adapted system in which acceptance itself became monetizable. And perhaps we should have thought more carefully about what that would do. But weren't publishers enormously expensive? At this point, somebody usually points out that academic publishing is a multi-billion-dollar business, paid largely from money intended for research, which is true. And as we have already seen, some publishers have adjusted operating margin approaching 40%. That's quite a lot. And is often presented as evidence that professional scientific publishing itself is fundamentally too expensive. But there is another useful question. Expensive compared with what? Research itself is enormously expensive. We pay salaries, we run laboratories, we buy chemical sequencing machines, microscopes and scanners, we run clinical trials, we maintain biobanks, We employ technicians, nurses, statisticians, data managers, and administrators. Serious research program can cost millions per year and produce only a handful of publications. At the system level, estimates depend heavily on exactly what we count, but scholarship publishing represents roughly 1 to 4% of total academic research expenditure. And this creates an interesting thought experiment. Suppose we solve scientific publishing completely. Let's say Elon Musk having colonized Mars and replaced the remaining workforce with Grok-powered robots, announces that he will now generously pay for all scientific publishing. Subscriptions disappear, APCs disappear, everything becomes free.
Everything is available basically for free. You can learn anything you want.
An extraordinary achievement. We have just made a global research enterprise roughly 1 to 4% cheaper. Useful, definitely, but probably not the transformation of science we sometimes imagine, which raises a more uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the professional scientific publishing was never fundamentally too expensive. Perhaps some publishers were simply too profitable, but these are not the same problem. Because spending a small fraction of the total research budget on selecting, editing, organizing, disseminating, and permanently archiving the output of the rest does not sound obviously absurd. Perhaps we misunderstood what we were paying for. One function in particular may have become more valuable over time: filtering. Millions of scientific papers are now published. Finding a paper about almost any topic is very easy. Finding the papers actually worth reading and building upon is much harder. The scarce resource is no longer access to information, is our attention. And this is where professional editors and selective journals may provide something that academia has perhaps undervalued: gatekeeping. I know, not currently one of the academia's favorite words, more or less a swear word, but some gatekeeping is useful.
How dare you!
A good editor is not simply asking, is this technically publishable? They are also asking, does it matter? Is this genuinely new? Will people learn something important from it? Is it good enough for us to recommend that readers spend their limited time on it? That judgment requires expertise. It requires independence. It requires disappointing quite a lot of good scientists who very much want their work to be published. And it costs money. We tried many alternatives. Over the past 2 decades, we have experimented with many ways of reducing traditional gatekeeping: mega journals, preprints, post-publication reviews, open peer reviews, community reviewing, publishing everything that passes technical threshold, and allowing readers to decide what matters later. Many of these are useful innovations. Preprints, in particular, have become extremely valuable. However, during the early COVID-19 period, we saw both the advantage and the obvious risk of rapid open dissemination. Thousands of preliminary findings appeared while the world was desperately looking for certainty. Some were excellent, some were not. Even specialists struggled to determine what deserved confidence.
That is one big pile of shit.
Despite the overall shift towards open access, something interesting happened. Researchers still care enormously about where the paper is published. Hiring committees care, grant panels care, scientists care, readers use journals' names as filters. Perhaps some of that is irrational prestige seeking, but perhaps part of it reflects something real. Filtering is not an obsolete function. When there is far more information that anyone can possibly consume, trusted selection becomes more valuable, not less. Maybe we optimized the wrong problem. The visible absurdity of scientific publishing is easy to describe. Researcher does publicly funded work, writes a paper, reviews other researchers' papers for free, and then receives an invoice for several thousands of euros to make their own paper publicly available. It is difficult not to find this ridiculous. But perhaps the biggest mistake was not that we wanted open access. Open access was and remains a good objective. We may simply have tried to achieve everything at once without carefully considering the consequences. We could have made accepted manuscripts freely available. We could have negotiated harder subscription prices. We could have challenged excessive publisher margins. And we could have preserved stronger incentives for journals to select rather than simply process more papers. Instead, we created rather an unusual alignment. Universities reward scientists for publishing more papers, preferably open access. And the publishing industry discovered that these arrangements could create rather considerable value for the investors. This may not be an ideal combination. We wanted science to be open. You were right to want that. But perhaps we should have been a little more careful what we wished for. That is all I wanted to say about this. And apparently I'm now also supposed to ask you to subscribe. I may make another video soon. Bye.